In a lot of places in America, homelessness is out of control. Some Americans are homeless by choice, and some of us don't have anywhere to go because of drug addictions or poverty, mean they have to sleep in tents, cars, or in shelters. Sometimes it's things out of their control, disenfranchisement, lack of jobs, or a natural disaster. A lot of these people aren't just living on the streets, they're dying on them too. Currently, on an average night, it's estimated that about 550,000 Americans sleep somewhere that isn't their permanent residence, though that number is likely very low considering it's difficult to get an exact count. About half of them are unsheltered on the streets, or in tents, or in their cars, or in abandoned buildings, and the other half lives in emergency shelters or transitional housing programs. And of our homeless population, most are men, and 2/3 are alone, or without families. Overall, however, the number of homeless people has ticked down by about 14% since 2010. We'll get into why that is later in the video, but we're also going to show which cities have historically high homeless populations and which cities are seeing their homeless populations explode. Hint, hint, California. So let's look at which cities in the country have the most homeless people. Sometimes you want to go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You want to be where you can see the troubles are all the same. You want to be where everybody knows your name. We begin our homeless tour of America's hubs in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, where the estimated number of homeless people is about 6,100 people. Philadelphia has a 26% poverty rate, low wages, high housing costs, and a lack of affordable transportation, which all contribute to the problem of homelessness here. In addition, an opiate addiction crisis is causing the homeless population in the city to spike of late. Now, Philadelphia has tried many different plans. Nonprofits have stepped in to help the city with solutions like the city's Housing First initiative, which tries to help transition residents into permanent housing and address their mental health and addictions. Not too long ago, the city tore down a bunch of homeless tents in some of its worst neighborhoods, but that only scattered the problem. And by the way, surprisingly, Honolulu barely missed this list. They have 5,000 homeless people there. Certainly not paradise in Hawaii for a lot of people, I guess. Now, for many, the glitz and glamour of Las Vegas is a vacation destination. Others were drawn here by the promise of luck and fortune, only to be met with despair and hopelessness. About 6,200 people here do not have a permanent place to sleep each night. Many of them are areas blocks away from where you may gamble and frolic. Now, one fascinating aspect of the Las Vegas's homeless population are the sewer dwellers. Beneath the streets of Vegas live hundreds of people who come out of their dark, damp dwellings to panhandle each day. Some of them even wear nice suits, and they put them on and they walk in the casinos and they pretend to be wealthy gamblers, and they get free food and drinks. The city of Vegas spends hundreds of thousands of dollars every year removing the homeless people from its sewers. Many people have asked, doesn't Las Vegas have the money to help its homeless? Why are there so many people on the streets here? We have a few more stops on the East Coast, the first of which is Boston, which has an estimated homeless population of about 6,300 people. In Boston, about half of the homeless population are families, unlike on the West Coast, which is mostly single men. In Massachusetts overall, the number of homeless families has more than doubled in the past 9 years. Now, relatively few people in Boston are sleeping outside because Massachusetts is one of a few places in the US where folks have a legal right to shelter. That means if you're a Massachusetts resident and you have kids, you cannot be left out in the cold. The state of New York and Washington, D.C. also have right to shelter laws. Of course, this all takes a lot of money. When the shelters are full, the city puts its homeless in motels. There's currently about 1,000 families living in Massachusetts-sponsored hotel rooms. Our first, but certainly not last stop in California, brings us to San Jose, where there's about 6,500 homeless people on any given night. Now, California as a whole has a huge problem dealing with homelessness. Nearly half of all unsheltered people in the country are in this one state alone. Of course, San Jose is in the wealthy Silicon Valley, which is one reason for its huge homeless population. A lot of people here say they work full-time jobs, but still can't afford to rent a place here. And there's not a lot of shelter space, which means a lot of people here live in their streets or in their cars. San Jose also has more homeless veterans than anywhere else in the country. San Jose has just opened up its first homeless tiny community. The city, along with volunteers, built cheap little tiny houses that homeless here can live in for up to 2 months before they have to transition to permanent housing. They're 3D building hemp houses in Australia. That's cool. Maybe we could 3D print homes for homeless people, right? What about pineapples? SpongeBob was able to make that happen. Or mushrooms? There has to be an organic alternative to affordable housing somewhere. Now, before we get too far, let's talk big picture here. Now, one big reason for homelessness in places like San Jose are the rapidly increasing home prices. And a big reason for that is heavy regulation of housing markets. Now, President Trump has made an executive order to eliminate regulatory barriers to affordable housing. The regulations include overly restrictive zoning, growth management controls, rent controls, cumbersome building codes, and overly burdensome environmental regulations. So basically, President Trump's goal is to remove restrictions, thereby making it easier for low-income housing to be built. The theory is that these building regulations are reducing the housing supply. The White House estimates that deregulation would result in a homeless drop of between 54% in places like San Francisco to 19% in places like Baltimore. The White House published a big giant report on the whole thing, and it's filled with complicated charts and graphs. And President Trump's also working to keep illegal drugs out of the country and trying to regulate the prescription drug market, hoping less available narcotics will also help the problem. Speaking of our nation's capital, it has a growing number of homeless people at an estimated 8,300 people. The number of homeless in Washington, D.C. has grown by 30% over the last 10 years. The high cost of living in the nation's capital is to blame, as is the most aggressive gentrification program in the country. A lot of low-wage workers, especially single moms with kids, just can't find stable, affordable housing here anymore. Now, I just went to DC, and you can totally see how they're cleaning up all the formerly low-income areas. And that's just moving the poorer people onto the streets or into nearby cities like Baltimore. Sorry, Baltimore. Now, you don't hear too much about San Diego's woes very often, but this picturesque city is challenged with a homeless population that's estimated at 8,700 people. Like many cities on this list, most of it's because of a lack of affordable housing. Even people who get housing vouchers are often unable to use them because of low vacancy rates and high rents. Plus, redevelopment downtowns cause cheap single-room occupancy units to vanish, pushing people onto the street. San Diego also has the second largest population of homeless veterans in the country. So is there like a place where we can build a big giant homeless shelter? Like a giant low-income project? We need a state. But where? The Midwest? No. What about New Mexico? We could build it out in the desert. I wonder how big it would have to be and how much it would cost. Okay, so there's 500,000 homeless people. What's the average cost to build a single unit? $64,000. Okay, they don't need a really nice place. So let's say 50,000 per unit. So that's 50,000 times 500,000, 2.5 E10. What's that? Let's try this. 500,000 homeless people times 50,000 per apartment. 25 billion? That's like 500 million per state to build a big giant apartment complex in New Mexico. Somebody start a GoFundMe. Now we're getting some big numbers now. Our next stop is Seattle, or as some call it, Freeattle, as in free food, free medical, free healthcare, free tents, free clothes. Now, rising rents and cuts to government programs are part of the reason Seattle has 9,000 homeless people. Now, Seattle's straight up struggling to try to figure out what to do with all the homeless people that are living on the streets and in encampments everywhere. They're trying to build teeny houses, but only a few dozen have actually been built. And the city's mayor, Ed Murray, said he wants to raise property taxes that are going to provide millions of dollars to help combat homelessness here. But people in Seattle are pissed about the way the city is handling the problem. Members of the police department say the city's made their job difficult, basically telling them not to enforce drug use, littering, and property crimes, almost catering to the homeless here. And a lot of cops are quitting because, in effect, they are law enforcement officers not allowed to enforce the law. That means even less cops on the streets, making the problem worse. It's like 10,000 homeless people are keeping this city of 700,000 hostage. There's a Facebook page called Seattle Looks Like Shit because, well, Seattle looks like shit. To them anyway. Needles in the park, poop in the cemetery, trash on the side of the highways. Some say Seattle's dying. In case you haven't heard, San Francisco is straight up struggling to deal with its estimated 11,000 homeless people. Now, they only have 1,300 shelter beds here, which means many of the homeless people end up sleeping on the street, or in tents, or in other spots around the city. Now, this has been a safe haven for a very long time for the addicted, the weird, the lost souls, and they're catered to and they're protected here. San Francisco is an eyesore. Many of the locations here set up to help the homeless are smack dab in the middle of the city. It's a dirty, filthy place covered in urine, feces, trash, and needles. Property crime here is the highest in the nation, and the homeless population is a big part of that. Now, if you thought San Francisco was bad, LA is just a nightmare. It's actually at a breaking point here, and there's so many homeless people that they actually have to spray the streets down with bleach. There's about 36,000 homeless people here. That's like the entire population of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And it's risen by 75% in the past 6 years. LA ranks 4th in the world for its homeless population. Mumbai, India has 60,000 people, and Manila in the Philippines has 70,000 homeless people. Now, in places like Boston and Philadelphia, where it's cold, most of the homeless people are in shelters. But in LA, 75% of all the homeless people are living on the streets, or in cars, or in other makeshift situations. And that's the second highest rate in the country. Just in downtown LA, there's a 50-block radius called Skid Row, which is filled with tents, attics, and trash. Now, of course, it's cost of housing is largely to blame. LA's mayor, Eric Garcetti, is building temporary housing units, almost giant circus tents. They call them bridge homes. LA is also trying to build as much permanent housing specifically for the homeless as they can. They're going to have new rooms, free mental health, addiction treatment centers, and of course, free food. But the city's running out of money, and so they can't build enough of these units. And also, word's out, so there's more homeless people flocking here all the time. Of course, New York City is going to have the most homeless people. They're the biggest city. New York City alone has over 1/5 of all sheltered homeless people in the U.S. And 13% of all homeless people live in New York City alone. But only 4% of the homeless people here live on the street because it's cold. And as mentioned earlier, New York is a right to shelter state. But because of a lack of shelter space, New York City has been spending millions of dollars every year to house the homeless in hotels. So that does it, the most homeless cities in America. These are the cities that are trying to figure out a way to help as many people as they can get shelter and assistance. And since homeless rates are ticking down a little bit, it'll be interesting to see if the homeless population of America continues to make its way out west. It's a very complicated problem we have here in pockets of our country, and with that comes a very complicated solution. But I still like my giant housing project in New Mexico idea. Email me if you want to help me start a fundraiser for it. Now, we talked a lot about the problems of homelessness. There's a lot you and I can both do to help. You can donate your time by looking up places like feedingamerica.org or help people in transition at places like womensshelters.org, or just a sandwich, a bottle of water, or a friendly smile. Because while their lifestyle isn't necessarily something we might agree with, their situation is really desperate and pretty sad. There's some links in the description. Hey guys, if you learned something new or you just like this video, make sure to like it. And if you really like this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get all of our videos about what it's like to live in different places in America. Peace.